Thanks for clicking. I hope you enjoy the story. Emma Carter stood on the creaking wooden porch of her grandparents' house, the sun casting a golden glow over the overgrown fields that once flourished with wildflowers. The house, a two-story relic with peeling white paint and shutters hanging by a single hinge, had been the backdrop of her childhood summers. It was here she'd learned to bake pies in the warm, fragrant kitchen with her grandmother, and here her grandfather had taught her how to fish in the stream that ran along the edge of the property. Now, though, the house was tired. The roof sagged under years of neglect, the floors were warped from water damage, and the walls had faded into a dull gray from decades of weathering the elements. But to Emma, it was more than just a house. It was her connection to her family, a legacy she couldn't let crumble into dust. Her dream was simple: restore the house to its former glory while infusing it with modern comforts. She wanted the warm, welcoming home her grandparents had built, but with sleek hardwood floors, energy-efficient windows, and a bright kitchen where she could bake pies of her own. As the sun dipped lower on the horizon, Emma clutched her folder of renovation plans and returned to her car, excitement bubbling in her chest. She had spent months preparing, reading articles about home restoration, saving every extra dollar from her marketing job, and even learning the basics of interior design. Now, she was ready to bring in the professionals. The following week, Emma contacted several contractors in the area. The first two estimates came from older, no-nonsense builders whose straightforward but slightly gruff demeanor didn't match Emma's vision of a collaborative project. Their bids, while reasonable, didn't leave her feeling confident. Then, she met Blake Aldridge. Blake arrived at the house in a spotless white truck with his company's logo, Aldridge Renovations, emblazoned in bold, stylish letters. A tall man in his late 30s, he had an easy smile, firm handshake, and a clipboard full of brochures and reference photos. His charisma was undeniable. "Wow, this place has so much potential," Blake said, running a hand along the faded porch railing. "You've got a gem here, Emma. We'll have this place looking like it belongs in a magazine." Emma smiled, reassured by his enthusiasm. As they walked through the house, Blake pointed out areas that needed immediate attention, such as the roof and foundation. His knowledge seemed extensive, and he peppered his comments with just enough technical jargon to sound credible without overwhelming her. When Emma hesitated about the budget, Blake leaned on his charm. "Listen, I know renovations can get pricey, but I pride myself on working within my clients' budgets. You're not just hiring a contractor. You're hiring someone who cares about your vision." By the end of their meeting, Emma was sold. Blake's estimate was slightly higher than the others, but he promised premium materials and a timeline of just 3 months. His glowing online reviews further convinced her she was making the right choice. The contract was signed, and the deposit was wired the next day. Emma marked the start date on her calendar with a bright red circle, feeling the first flickers of excitement. The morning the renovations began, Emma arrived at the property early, armed with coffee and muffins for the crew. She watched as a team of workers unloaded tools and equipment, their chatter filling the quiet air. Blake was there, of course, clipboard in hand, directing the operation like a conductor leading an orchestra. "This is going to be a transformation, Emma," Blake said with a grin. "Trust me, you're going to love it." For the first few days, everything seemed to go smoothly. The old carpeting was torn out, revealing the original hardwood floors beneath, and the workers began assessing the foundation. Blake sent regular updates, and Emma felt reassured she had made the right decision. But beneath the surface of this promising start, cracks were already forming. Emma's excitement about the renovations carried her through the first few weeks, but the initial momentum quickly began to falter. The first red flag came during a routine progress update. Blake had asked to meet at the property to discuss some unexpected issues with the materials Emma had chosen. The morning of their meeting was bright and crisp, the kind of day that made Emma feel productive and hopeful. She arrived at the house with a notepad in hand, ready to address whatever concerns Blake had. When she pulled into the driveway, however, her heart sank. The site, which had once bustled with workers and activity, was eerily quiet. Blake greeted her with his trademark smile, but there was an edge to his demeanor. He gestured toward a stack of unopened boxes on the front porch. "Bad news, Emma. The supplier for your flooring called this morning. They're completely out of stock. I've got some alternatives to show you, but they're going to be a bit more expensive. Quality stuff, though." Emma frowned, glancing at the boxes. The labels indicated they contained the flooring she'd ordered, but Blake was quick to redirect her attention to a glossy catalog he pulled from his clipboard. "These are a much better option, honestly. The kind of material that lasts a lifetime." The prices listed were nearly double what she'd budgeted. Emma hesitated, feeling a small knot of unease forming in her stomach. "But aren't these the floors I ordered?" she asked, pointing to the boxes. Blake waved dismissively. "Oh, those? That's just a partial shipment. Definitely not enough to finish the job. Trust me, Emma, you don't want to end up with mismatched flooring halfway through." Reluctantly, Emma agreed to the upgrade. It seemed like a reasonable compromise at the time, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Over the next 2 weeks, the delays began. Emma's first clue came in the form of missed phone calls. Blake, who had been prompt and attentive during the early stages of the project, now took hours, sometimes days, to return her messages. When she did manage to reach him, his tone was apologetic but vague. "The crew's running behind on another job," he explained during one call. "But we'll be back at your place tomorrow, no problem." Tomorrow turned into next week, and next week stretched into 10 days. During this time, Emma made multiple trips to the house, only to find minimal progress. The workers had demolished part of the old kitchen and stripped the walls in the living room, but little else had been done. The lack of activity was frustrating enough, but the invoices Blake sent were even more alarming. Each one included vague descriptions of additional repairs and emergency fixes that Emma didn't recall approving. When she confronted Blake about the charges, his easygoing demeanor shifted. Look, Emma, these are things we had to address immediately. If we hadn't, the structural integrity of the house would have been at risk. I'm just trying to keep things on track for you. His words sounded reasonable, but Emma couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that she was being taken advantage of. She decided to ask for a breakdown of the costs, but Blake brushed off the request. Emma, you've got to trust me on this. I've been doing this for 20 years. I know what I'm doing. By the second month, Emma was reaching her breaking point. She had originally budgeted for some unexpected costs. Every renovation came with surprises, after all, but the project was now over budget by nearly 40%. Worse, there was no clear timeline for completion. One afternoon, Emma decided to visit the property unannounced. As she approached the house, she noticed something odd. There was no sign of the crew. The tools that had been left scattered around the yard were now gone, and the house itself appeared untouched since her last visit. She called Blake immediately. His response was curt. The guys had to take care of another job today. We'll be back tomorrow. When Emma demanded an explanation for the lack of progress, Blake sighed heavily. Emma, I'm doing everything I can here. These things happen in construction. You've got to be patient. It was the first time his tone carried a hint of irritation, and it left Emma feeling both frustrated and powerless. That evening, as she sat at her kitchen table poring over invoices, Emma's phone buzzed with a text from her neighbor, Mr. Grayson. Hey, Emma. Saw your contractor's truck in town earlier. Looked like he was heading out to a new job site. Everything okay with your project? The message hit Emma like a punch to the gut. Blake had insisted his crew was tied up with another job that day, so why hadn't he told her about it? And if they were starting new projects before finishing hers, where was her money going? Emma stared at the text, a sense of unease settling in her chest. She didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the evidence was mounting. Blake's charm and reassurances had masked the growing list of red flags, but now, she couldn't ignore them any longer. She decided then and there that she needed to dig deeper. Something wasn't adding up, and if Blake wasn't going to give her answers, she would find them herself. Emma sat on her porch the next morning, sipping coffee and staring blankly at her open laptop. The invoices Blake had sent were spread across the small table in front of her, their inflated charges glaring up at her like accusations. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being played, but she didn't know where to start in unraveling the truth. Her thoughts were interrupted by the familiar sound of footsteps crunching on gravel. Looking up, she saw her neighbor, Mr. Grayson, walking up the driveway with his usual steady gait. At 72, Mr. Grayson was a retired engineer who had lived in the neighborhood for decades. His practical wisdom and quiet demeanor had made him a trusted confidant since Emma had moved to the area. Morning, Emma, he said, tipping his worn baseball cap. Thought I'd check in and see how things are going with the renovations. Emma sighed, gesturing to the mess of paperwork in front of her. Not great, honestly. The contractor keeps coming up with excuses, and the costs are way higher than I expected. It feels like they've barely done anything to the house. Mr. Grayson raised an eyebrow and settled into the chair across from her. Who'd you hire? Aldrich Renovations, Emma replied. Blake Aldrich. He came highly recommended. At the mention of Blake's name, Mr. Grayson frowned. Aldrich, huh? I've heard of him. Not all good things, I'm afraid. Emma's heart sank. What do you mean? Grayson leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. A few years ago, my cousin hired him to redo her kitchen. At first, everything seemed fine. He's got a way of putting people at ease, you know? But halfway through the project, he started tacking on extra costs for things she hadn't agreed to. When she pushed back, he got defensive, and the work slowed to a crawl. Took her almost a year to get the project finished, and even then, the quality wasn't what she'd been promised. Emma's stomach churned. Did she do anything about it? She tried, Grayson said with a shrug. Filed a complaint with the Better Business Bureau, but it didn't go anywhere. He's slick, that one. Knows just how far to push without crossing any obvious legal lines. Emma's mind raced. She had dismissed her earlier doubts as paranoia, but now, with Grayson's story echoing her own experiences, she couldn't ignore the possibility that Blake was running a scam. Thanks for telling me, she said, her voice resolute. I think it's time I started looking into this more carefully. That afternoon, Emma dove into research. She started by reviewing the contract she'd signed with Blake, noting every clause and loophole. The document was riddled with vague language about unforeseen circumstances and material substitutions, giving Blake plenty of room to justify his additional charges. Next, she turned her attention to Aldrich Renovations' online presence. At first glance, the company's reviews seemed glowing, dozens of 5-star ratings on multiple platforms. But as Emma dug deeper, she noticed a pattern. Many of the positive reviews came from accounts with generic usernames and no other activity, raising the suspicion that they were fake. More concerning were the negative reviews she found buried beneath the glowing testimonials. One homeowner described how Blake had abandoned their project midway, leaving them with a gutted bathroom and a $10,000 bill for unexpected plumbing issues. Another complained about shoddy craftsmanship that required thousands of dollars in repairs after Blake's crew had left. Emma felt a chill run down her spine as she read more accounts of Blake's behavior. The similarities to her own experience were undeniable. Determined to gather as much information as possible, Emma reached out to a few of the disgruntled reviewers. She sent polite messages explaining her situation and asking if they'd be willing to share their stories. To her surprise, several responded within hours. One of them, a woman named Clara, offered to speak over the phone. I'm so sorry you're going through this, Clara said when Emma called her that evening. Blake is a nightmare. He overcharged me by thousands of dollars and left my kitchen in such bad shape I had to hire another contractor to fix it. What did you do about it? Emma asked. I tried to get my money back, Clara said bitterly. But he covered his tracks. The contract was airtight, and by the time I realized what was happening, he'd already moved on to his next job. Emma's resolve hardened as she listened to Clara's story. Thank you for sharing this with me, she said. I'm going to do everything I can to stop him from doing this to anyone else. The next day, Emma reached out to her cousin Lila, who worked as a paralegal. Over coffee, Emma laid out her suspicions and asked for advice. First thing you need to do is document everything, Lila said. Every invoice, every email, every text. If he's overcharging you or failing to deliver what he promised, you'll need proof to back up your claims. Emma nodded, already mentally cataloging the evidence she had collected. Second, Lila continued, look into his licensing. If he's cutting corners, there's a chance he's not operating entirely above board. And if you can find other people he's scammed, you might be able to build a case against him. Emma left the meeting feeling more determined than ever. Blake had underestimated her, but he wouldn't get away with it. Not this time. By the end of the week, Emma had a plan. Armed with the stories of other victims and the advice from Lila, she began piecing together a strategy to hold Blake accountable. She didn't know how long it would take or how much energy it would require, but one thing was certain. She wouldn't rest until justice was served. Emma sat in her small home office, the soft glow of her desk lamp illuminating the stack of papers in front of her. The evidence she had gathered over the past week painted a troubling picture of Blake Aldridge and his business practices. Each review, invoice, and testimonial added a new layer to the puzzle, and with every discovery, Emma's resolve to bring him to justice grew stronger. Her first breakthrough came while digging through the local government's contractor licensing database. Blake's name and company were listed, but the license was flagged as provisional. A quick search revealed that this status meant Blake's company had not yet met all the necessary requirements for a fully certified contractor. Provisional license? Emma muttered under her breath. What does that even mean? She called the licensing office the next morning, posing her questions to a patient clerk named Ms. Harris. It means he's allowed to operate, but he hasn't submitted all the paperwork we require, Ms. Harris explained. It could be something minor, like an incomplete insurance policy. Or it could be something more serious, like failing to pass an inspection. Emma's heart raced. Is there a way to find out if he's had complaints filed against him? There's a public record database, Ms. Harris said. You can search his company's name to see if there's a history of issues. Emma thanked her and immediately pulled up the database. Within minutes, she found several complaints tied to Aldridge renovations. Most were marked as resolved, but a few were still under investigation. The complaints ranged from poor workmanship to accusations of fraudulent billing. One case, filed just 3 months ago, caught her eye. A homeowner alleged that Blake had used substandard materials for their roof replacement, despite charging for premium quality products. The homeowner had eventually hired a third-party inspector, who confirmed their suspicions. Feeling emboldened, Emma decided to contact the homeowner directly. She tracked them down through a local homeowners forum and sent a carefully worded message explaining her situation. The homeowner, a man named Dan, agreed to meet her at a coffee shop the next day. Dan was in his early 40s, with a no-nonsense demeanor and a stack of papers tucked under his arm. As they sipped their coffee, he recounted his experience with Blake. The guy's a smooth talker, I'll give him that, Dan said. He convinced me to pay extra for high-grade shingles and then slapped cheap ones on my roof. When I called him out, he denied everything and said I must have misunderstood the contract. I had to get a lawyer involved just to get him to refund part of the cost. Emma nodded, scribbling notes in her notebook. Did you ever consider taking legal action? Dan shook his head. I thought about it, but Blake's contracts are airtight. Plus, he's got a way of dragging things out until you're too tired, or too broke, to keep fighting. I cut my losses and moved on. Emma left the meeting feeling a mix of anger and determination. Blake wasn't just cutting corners. He was running a well-oiled scam, preying on homeowners who didn't have the resources to fight back. That evening, Emma compiled everything she had. The complaints, the testimonials, the suspicious invoices, and the inconsistencies in Blake's explanations. She created a detailed timeline of her own project, highlighting the delays, the inflated charges, and the lack of progress. But she knew she needed more. If she was going to take Blake down, she couldn't do it alone. The next morning, Emma met with her growing network of Blake's former clients. They gathered in the community room of the local library, each armed with their own stories of frustration and betrayal. Clara, the woman Emma had spoken to on the phone, brought photos of the unfinished kitchen Blake had left behind. Dan shared copies of the inspection report that had exposed Blake's use of subpar materials. Another homeowner, Sarah, described how Blake had disappeared halfway through her bathroom renovation, leaving her with a half-tiled floor and a $5,000 bill. As Emma listened to their stories, an idea began to take shape. Blake had relied on his victims feeling isolated and powerless. But what if they joined forces? We have to make this public, Emma said, her voice steady but passionate. If we share our stories, we can warn other people before they fall into the same trap. And if we work together, we might even be able to build a legal case against him. The group agreed, their frustration morphing into a shared sense of purpose. They decided to start by creating a website where they could post their experiences with Aldridge renovations. Emma volunteered to design it, using her marketing skills to ensure it reached as many people as possible. Over the next few weeks, the website went live. Titled Aldridge Exposed, it featured testimonials, photos, and a detailed breakdown of the complaints filed against Blake. Emma and the group also reached out to local news outlets, offering interviews and evidence of Blake's misconduct. The response was overwhelming. Within days, the website received hundreds of views, and more homeowners came forward with their own horror stories. Reporters began calling Emma, eager to cover the unfolding scandal. But Emma wasn't done yet. She wanted more than public awareness. She wanted accountability. With the help of Lila, her paralegal cousin, she began compiling a formal complaint to file with the state's licensing board. As she submitted the final document, Emma felt a surge of satisfaction. Blake had built his business on lies and exploitation, but now, the foundation of his empire was starting to crack. Blake Aldridge sat in his truck, parked at a gas station on the edge of town, his phone buzzing incessantly on the dashboard. He ignored the calls, staring out the windshield at nothing in particular. The past few days had been chaos, clients demanding refunds, news reporters leaving voicemails, and worst of all, a growing online smear campaign against his company. When he'd first heard about the website, he hadn't taken it seriously. People complained about contractors all the time. It was the nature of the business. But when he clicked on the link someone had forwarded to him, his stomach dropped. The site was a detailed, damning exposé of Aldridge renovations. Photos of botched jobs and incomplete projects filled the screen, accompanied by testimonials from angry homeowners. Emma's name appeared prominently as the site's creator, along with a timeline of her own experiences. The accusations were impossible to ignore. Blake slammed his hand on the steering wheel, frustration bubbling to the surface. He had always prided himself on staying one step ahead, but this was a problem he couldn't charm his way out of. Meanwhile, Emma's campaign against Blake was gaining momentum. The website had gone viral in the local community, and her inbox was flooded with messages from homeowners who had been wronged by Aldridge renovations. Each news story strengthened her resolve, and the mounting evidence began to attract attention from legal professionals. One of those professionals was Kate Larson, a consumer protection lawyer who reached out to Emma after seeing the website. They met at a small cafe downtown, where Kate laid out her thoughts on how to proceed. "You've done an incredible job gathering evidence," Kate said, flipping through the binder Emma had brought. "But if we're going to take this to court, we need to prove a pattern of fraud. That means connecting the dots between the complaints and showing that Blake intentionally misled his clients." Emma nodded, her hands gripping her coffee cup. "I want to do whatever it takes to hold him accountable. He's gotten away with this for too long." Kate smiled. "Good. Because I think we have a solid case. With the testimonials you've collected, plus the discrepancies in his invoices and the licensing issues, we can argue that his actions were deliberate." The plan was to file a civil lawsuit on behalf of Emma and the other homeowners who had come forward. The goal was twofold: to recover their losses and to prevent Blake from continuing his deceptive practices. The first sign that Blake was feeling the pressure came a week later. Emma was at the property, checking on the house that still sat in disarray, when her phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number. She hesitated before answering, but the voice on the other end was unmistakable. "Emma, it's Blake." Emma's grip tightened on the phone. "What do you want?" Blake sighed heavily. "Look, I know things haven't gone as planned with your project. I want to make it right." Emma's jaw clenched. "You mean now that everyone knows what you've been doing?" There was a pause before Blake responded, his tone defensive. "I've had some tough breaks lately. The crew's been stretched thin, and I didn't mean for things to get so out of hand. Let me come back and finish the work. No extra charge." Emma almost laughed at the audacity of the offer. "You think I'd trust you to fix this after everything you've done?" Blake's voice grew sharper. "I'm trying to help you here, Emma. If you keep pushing this, it's only going to get uglier, for both of us." Emma's anger flared. "That sounds like a threat, Blake. And just so you know, I've already got a lawyer. You won't intimidate me." She hung up before he could respond, her heart pounding. The conversation confirmed what she already knew. Blake was feeling the heat, and he was desperate to regain control. Word of Emma's legal action spread quickly. The local news ran a segment on the growing controversy, interviewing several of Blake's former clients. The story painted a damning picture of Aldridge renovations, and the public backlash was swift. Blake's current clients began pulling out of their contracts, demanding refunds for work that hadn't been completed. Suppliers who had worked with Aldridge renovations distanced themselves from the company, refusing to fulfill new orders. Even some of Blake's crew members quit, unwilling to be associated with the scandal. For the first time in years, Blake found himself on the defensive. His usual tricks, charm, excuses, and intimidation were no longer working. And with Emma's lawsuit looming, he knew he couldn't afford to ignore the mounting pressure. Emma, meanwhile, was relentless. She continued to build her case with Kate's guidance, gathering receipts, inspection reports, and testimonies. She also worked with the state licensing board to push for an investigation into Blake's provisional status. One afternoon, she received a call from Ms. Harris at the licensing office. "Ms. Carter, I wanted to let you know that we've flagged Aldridge renovations for formal review. Based on the evidence you provided, it appears Mr. Aldridge has violated several terms of his provisional license." Emma's heart leapt. "What does that mean?" "If the review confirms our findings, his license could be suspended or revoked. That would prevent him from legally operating in the state." It was exactly the breakthrough Emma had hoped for. She thanked Ms. Harris and immediately called Kate to share the news. "That's fantastic," Kate said. "It strengthens our case even more. If he loses his license, it'll show the court that his actions were part of a larger pattern of misconduct." As Emma prepared for the next steps, she couldn't help but feel a sense of vindication. Blake had underestimated her, assuming she would be another victim too overwhelmed to fight back. But now, his empire was crumbling, and she was leading the charge. Still, she knew the battle wasn't over. The lawsuit and licensing review were just the beginning, and Blake wasn't likely to go down without a fight. But Emma was ready. For the first time in months, she felt like she had the upper hand, and she wasn't going to let it go. Blake sat at his kitchen table, his hands trembling as he scrolled through the latest batch of emails. His inbox was filled with complaints, legal threats, and angry messages. The Aldridge Exposed website had grown exponentially, with new posts appearing almost every day. He had never imagined that a few disgruntled clients would come together and cause such a massive wave of backlash. The worst part was the licensing board's review. Blake had received a letter notifying him that his provisional license was under scrutiny. If the board found his actions to be in violation of state regulations, his ability to operate as a contractor could be revoked. And without his license, his entire business would collapse. This is getting out of hand, Blake muttered to himself, running his hands through his hair. He had been running Aldridge renovations for over a decade, and while it hadn't always been smooth sailing, he had never faced a threat like this. The attention from the media, the legal pressure from Emma and her lawyer, and now the real possibility of losing his livelihood, it was all too much. Blake's phone buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. The name on the screen was unfamiliar, but he answered anyway. Blake Aldridge, the voice on the other end asked. This is Greg Michaels, from Michaels and Associates. We've been following the situation with your company, and we think we can help you. Blake sat up straighter, his pulse quickening. What kind of help are we talking about? We specialize in crisis management, Greg said smoothly. We've worked with a number of contractors in similar situations. If you want to avoid a public disaster and minimize the fallout, we can guide you through the legal process and help you manage the media storm. Blake's mind raced. Crisis management? A public disaster? He didn't have many options left, and if there was even a slim chance of salvaging his business, he needed to consider it. How much will this cost me? Blake asked, his voice tight. It depends on how far we need to go, but I can assure you it will be worth it to avoid a lawsuit and potential licensing suspension. Blake thought for a moment, then nodded. Okay, I'm in. Let's do it. Meanwhile, Emma and Kate were preparing for the next phase of their legal battle. The investigation into Blake's license was moving forward, and Emma was gathering the last pieces of the puzzle. With each passing day, more homeowners were coming forward, all with similar stories of overcharges, shoddy work, and unfinished projects. Emma knew that Blake was desperate to regain control, and she wasn't about to let up now. They had already filed the lawsuit on behalf of several homeowners, including Emma herself, and were preparing to file a formal complaint with the Better Business Bureau. Kate had also reached out to the media, arranging interviews and making sure the story of Blake's deceit spread as far and wide as possible. Emma's phone rang one afternoon while she was at her desk. It was Kate. Emma, we've got some important updates. Emma's stomach tightened. What's happening? I've just spoken with the licensing board. They've confirmed that they're moving forward with the review, and based on the evidence you've provided, there's a strong chance Blake will lose his license. Emma exhaled in relief, but didn't let herself relax just yet. What's the next step? We need to prepare for the hearing. The board will examine all the complaints, invoices, and any other evidence we've gathered. We also need to prepare our case for the court, if it comes to that. Emma nodded. Okay, I'm ready. Let's do this. Blake's crisis management team arrived the following week. Greg Michaels, the crisis consultant, wasted no time in getting to work. He started by advising Blake to make a public statement, an apology of sorts, though carefully crafted to minimize his accountability. The statement read, I deeply regret that some of our recent projects have not met the high standards we hold ourselves to at Aldridge Renovations. We are committed to resolving any issues and ensuring that all of our clients are satisfied. We take full responsibility for the mistakes made and are working diligently to rectify the situation. Blake's heart sank as he read the words. He knew this was just a surface-level apology designed to placate the public, not an actual admission of guilt. But his crisis team assured him it was necessary to regain some credibility. The statement was published on Aldridge Renovations' website and shared on social media. Blake hoped it would calm the storm, but instead, it only fueled the fire. The media pounced on the apology, analyzing it in minute detail. Critics pointed out that Blake didn't address any specific issues, and many saw it as insincere. Emma, on the other hand, saw the apology as a sign of weakness. It confirmed that Blake was feeling the pressure and was trying to salvage whatever was left of his reputation. She had been expecting this move, and now was time for her to ramp up her efforts. The lawsuit was progressing smoothly. The group of homeowners had gathered all their evidence, and Kate had secured a legal team that was ready to take Blake to court if necessary. Emma had also been in contact with local journalists who were eager to cover the full extent of Blake's deceit. One morning, she received an unexpected email. It was from Greg Michaels. Blake is interested in settling, the message read. He wants to meet to discuss a resolution. If you're open to negotiating, he's willing to offer a significant settlement to avoid going to court. Emma frowned. A settlement? She knew this was likely an attempt to avoid the public spectacle of a trial, but part of her wondered if it might be the way forward. She forwarded the email to Kate, who responded quickly. It's a common tactic, Kate said. Blake knows he's losing. A settlement might be a good option, but we need to make sure the terms are in your favor. Emma thought about it carefully. She didn't want to let Blake off the hook too easily, but the idea of putting an end to the ordeal was tempting. Blake had no idea how much longer he could keep up the charade. The stress was taking its toll, and the weight of his deceit was beginning to feel unbearable. But even as he realized the consequences of his actions, his pride wouldn't let him surrender completely. As the court date loomed closer, Blake prepared himself for a final round of negotiations. He had one last card to play, and he wasn't going down without a fight. The tension in the air was palpable as Blake sat across from Emma and her lawyer, Kate, in a quiet conference room. His crisis management consultant, Greg Michaels, had insisted on sitting in, though Blake could already feel the subtle power shift. This was no longer about negotiating from a position of control, it was about damage control. Emma sat across the table, calm and collected, her eyes unwavering as she met Blake's gaze. She had seen him for what he truly was, and no apology or smooth-talking consultant was going to change that. Greg opened the conversation, his voice steady and professional. Mr. Aldridge has acknowledged the issues with his company's recent projects, Greg began. We're here to discuss a resolution. The goal is to avoid going to trial and to settle this matter quickly and fairly for both parties. Emma remained silent, but Kate spoke up. We're willing to consider a settlement, but there are terms. First, we need a full refund for all the affected clients, including those who were overcharged or received substandard work. Blake's jaw tightened. He had been hoping for a more reasonable figure, but he knew he had little leverage left. His reputation was in tatters, his business was on the verge of collapse, and the state's licensing board was still reviewing his actions. Greg interjected, trying to redirect the conversation. Mr. Aldridge is prepared to offer financial compensation to the affected homeowners. However, he cannot provide full refunds for every client. He is willing to negotiate a reasonable figure that reflects the damages and losses incurred. Emma looked to Kate, who gave a slight nod. The second condition is that Aldridge Renovations publicly acknowledges its wrongdoing. We need a formal statement that is clear and unequivocal, acknowledging the specific issues with the work completed on these projects. Blake's face reddened. He hated the idea of publicly admitting his mistakes. It felt like admitting defeat. But he had no choice. If he didn't settle, the court case would expose everything, and that could mean losing his license permanently, along with a hefty fine, or worse. I can do that, Blake muttered, the words slipping out reluctantly. Third, Emma continued, we require an independent audit of Aldridge Renovations' business practices. We want a full investigation into your company's finances and operations, and that report will be made public. Blake bristled at the thought. The audit would expose everything, the shortcuts, the overcharges, the lies. But the alternative was far worse. Fine, he said, his voice clipped. And if we agree to these terms, there's no trials? That's right, Kate said, confirming their stance. Once the settlement is finalized, we'll drop the lawsuit and the licensing review. We'll also encourage other affected homeowners to accept the compensation. Blake glanced at Greg, who offered a small, reassuring nod. He wasn't getting a good deal, but it was the best option available. He had to make it work for the sake of his business and his reputation, what little was left of it. All right, Blake said, his voice tight with frustration. I'll agree to the terms. Let's get this over with. The final paperwork was drawn up quickly, with Kate and Greg working through the details. Emma signed the documents without hesitation, her eyes never leaving Blake's face. She had won, and she knew it. The settlement would force Blake to pay restitution to all the affected homeowners, make a public admission of his wrongdoing, and submit to an audit. As they finished up, Blake stood, shaking hands with Emma and Kate. His movements were stiff, his pride wounded, but he knew this was the end of the line. You've won, Blake muttered, his voice barely audible. But it's not over. I'll rebuild. Emma's expression softened, but only slightly. You might rebuild your business, but not your reputation. You'll never be the same, Blake. And neither will your company. In the weeks that followed, Blake's world continued to unravel. His company's name was tarnished beyond repair, and his personal reputation followed suit. The audit revealed discrepancies in his financial records, leading to further investigations and fines. Though he avoided a criminal charge, his ability to operate in the state was severely limited. Emma, meanwhile, saw the positive change she had hoped for. The homeowners who had been wronged by Blake received their refunds and compensation, and many of them offered their gratitude for Emma's persistence. She didn't feel triumphant. There was no joy in tearing someone down, but she did feel a sense of justice. Months later, Emma walked into a new office, the one she had been planning for weeks. It wasn't much, just a small space with a desk and a few filing cabinets, but it was hers. It was a symbol of her new beginning, a fresh start after the chaos that had consumed her life for so long. As she set up her computer, her phone buzzed with a text from Kate. Just want to let you know, Aldridge Renovations has officially filed for bankruptcy. It's all over for him. Emma sat back in her chair, reading the message twice. She hadn't expected it to end like this, but somehow it felt right. Blake had been given every chance to do the right thing, and he had refused. In the end, his greed and arrogance had led him to this inevitable downfall. She turned her attention back to the paperwork in front of her, the feeling of closure washing over her. Emma had fought for what was right, and in the end, that was all that mattered. As Emma continued to build her new life, Blake's downfall was a cautionary tale that echoed throughout the community. Aldridge Renovations was a company no one would soon forget, but its story was now one of failure, deceit, and the price of dishonesty. And for Emma, the satisfaction of having turned the tables was worth more than any settlement or apology. She had won, and justice had been served.